as the movement of more continues to operate, it creates the impression that accumulation will eventually resolve the underlying sense of insufficiency. If I have more, I will feel complete. If I reach more, I will finally arrive. If I understand more, the confusion will end. But when attention observes this carefully over time, a pattern becomes undeniable. No amount of more ends the movement, because what is being added is never addressing the root. The sense of lack is not in what is present. It is in how it is perceived. The mind approaches the present with a background assumption that something is missing. And from that assumption, it evaluates everything. Whatever is here is measured against what could be more. And therefore, it always falls short. This means that even when something is gained, the structure of perception remains unchanged. The mind still looks for more, because the lens through which it sees has not shifted. So the new becomes the current, and the current becomes insufficient. Again. This is why the movement never ends, because it is not driven by actual need. It is driven by perception. A perception shaped by comparison, by memory, by projection. The mind compares what is with what has been or what could be. And in that comparison, something is always lacking. This creates a continuous dissatisfaction, not necessarily intense, but persistent. A quiet feeling that something is incomplete. And from that feeling, the movement toward more begins again. But when attention begins to see this clearly, something important becomes visible. The issue is not how much is present. It is the structure that interprets it as not enough. And that structure is thought. Thought comparing. Thought projecting. Thought measuring. When this is seen directly, the entire movement begins to lose its authority, not because more is rejected, but because it is no longer seen as the solution. It is simply another extension of the same pattern. And in that realization, something begins to quiet. The urgency to accumulate starts to fade, because it is no longer believed that accumulation will resolve the underlying feeling. And in that quieting, something new begins to appear, not something added, but something revealed, a different relationship with what is present, one that is not based on comparison, not based on projection, but on direct perception, without the overlay of more. And in that, something begins to change fundamentally, because for the first time, what is here is not being measured against something else. It is simply seen as it is. When the underlying sense of not enough begins to dissolve, not through effort, not through positive thinking, but through direct understanding, something very different starts to emerge within experience. At first, it may go almost unnoticed, because the mind has been so accustomed to measuring, comparing, and seeking more that its absence feels unfamiliar. There is no longer a subtle pressure to improve the moment. No background movement saying this should be better. No quiet dissatisfaction pushing experience towards something else. And in that absence, something becomes immediately clear. What is here is not lacking. Not because it has been improved, but because it is no longer being compared. The sense of insufficiency was never in the moment itself. It was in the movement of thought around it. Now, without that movement, the moment stands on its own, complete. Not in an idealized way, not as something perfect, but as something that does not need to become something else. This creates a profound shift. The mind is no longer moving away from what is. It is not seeking to add, extend, or transform the experience into something more. It is simply present. And in that presence, there is a quiet fullness, not based on accumulation, not dependent on conditions, but inherent in the absence of lack. This fullness is not something that can be pursued, because it only appears when pursuit ends. It is not something that can be created, because it is what remains when the sense of insufficiency is no longer active. This changes the entire orientation of life. Action still happens. Growth still occurs where necessary. But it is no longer driven by the need to fill a gap. It is no longer shaped by the idea that something is missing. Instead, action arises from clarity, from what is needed, from what is appropriate, not from what is lacking. This brings a different kind of intelligence into living, one that is not reactive, not compensatory, but direct. And in that, there is a sense of ease, a lightness, because the burden of becoming more has ended. There is no longer a constant movement towards something else, only what is unfolding. And that is enough, not as a belief, not as a conclusion, but as a direct fact seen without distortion. And in that seeing, something becomes undeniable. Nothing needed to be added. Nothing needed to be completed. What was missing was never in the moment. It was in the perception. Now, without that distortion, what remains is what has always been here. Whole, undivided, and already complete. After the endless nature of pursuit has been seen, another subtle layer begins to reveal itself beneath it. The movement of more, not just wanting something specific, but wanting more of what is already there. More success, more recognition, more experience, more understanding, more pleasure, more clarity. The object may change, but the structure remains the same. What is present is not enough. Something must be added. Something must be increased. Something must be extended. This movement is deeply ingrained. It operates almost invisibly, because it is often seen as natural, even positive. The idea of growth, of expansion, of becoming more. But when attention begins to observe it carefully, something becomes clear. The movement of more is not actually about the object. It is about a feeling of insufficiency, a subtle sense that what is here now is incomplete. And from that sense, the mind begins to move toward increase, toward accumulation, toward extension. But no matter how much is added, the movement does not end. Because the sense of insufficiency was never resolved. It was only temporarily covered. Each time something is gained, there may be a brief sense of satisfaction. But soon, the movement returns. More. This reveals something fundamental. The desire for more is not driven by need. It is driven by a psychological structure. A structure that assumes lack and seeks to fill it. But what is being filled is not an actual absence. It is a perception, a belief. And because it is not seen clearly, the movement continues. From one form to another, endlessly. The mind becomes conditioned to never remain with what is. It is always moving beyond it, comparing, evaluating, expanding. And in doing so, it never fully experiences the present. Because the present is always being measured against something more, something else, something better. When this entire movement is seen, something begins to shift. The question is no longer how to achieve more. It becomes, what is this sense of not enough? Is it real? Or is it created? And in that question, the entire structure begins to reveal itself. Not as something to change, but as something to understand. Completely. As it happens. Now,